We are ready to get started. So welcome, everybody. Thank you all for being here. I'm delighted to be leading this session. I will keep my introduction brief. There's a lot to cover. I will say, I prepped for this session last week. I regret that decision. So much has happened sort of in the last 5 days that I feel like we need to tackle that I could throw these index cards out a window and we would be all set. But let me sort of lay the groundwork a little bit for everyone here. I think we all know and we can acknowledge that advances in AI, right, are ushering in sweeping changes to the national security landscape, right? So yes, generative AI can help you write better emails, sure, or it can be used to mass produce misinformation on digital platforms. AI can improve a company or a country's cybersecurity defenses, or it can be weaponized, right, as a tool for more sophisticated cyber attacks. So what I'm getting at with those examples ultimately is this idea of the dual-use nature and ultimately the dual-use dilemma that's inherent to this technology. And that's really what we're going to be digging into today, some of those dilemmas, some of those challenges, and hopefully spending a fair bit of time talking about potential solutions, ways that government and industry can collaborate, and that countries with different geopolitical agendas can come together to make sure that AI innovation, as quickly as it is moving forward, we hope, with the necessary safeguards in place. So a quick reminder, if you're watching on the live stream, you can share thoughts on this panel using the hashtag WF25. And I am going to set aside time for questions. I'm hoping for about 10 minutes. So for those of you in the room, start thinking now. I want to see hands raised in about 35 minutes. Now, we have a stellar lineup, so please join me in welcoming. We have Nick Clegg, outgoing President of Global Affairs at Meta. We have Henna Virkunen, Executive Vice President for Tech Sovereignty, Security and Democracy with the European Commission. It's hard to see all of you. We have Ian Bremmer, President and Founder of Eurasia Group. We have Dr. Lan Zhu, Dean, Schwarzman College, Tsinghua University, People's Republic of China. And lastly, we have Jeremy Fleming, who has had a many decades-long career in security out of the UK. So let's sort of dig into this. I'd like to really start quickly, rapid fire, just ground this for everybody here, for everybody on the live stream. I think so often when people think about AI and they see that paired with national security, they think about military applications, right? But this subject is so much broader than that, which I alluded to. So Nick, starting with you, very briefly, for each of you, from where you sit, give us one specific example of what kind of security threats we are talking about in the context of AI, just to really sort of articulate how big a subject this is.
Well, I'd start by saying we talk about dual use. It's multi-use. It's general use. That's the point about this technology. It isn't a thing. It won't apply to one weapon or one system. It will apply to everything. It'll act as an accelerant to everything we do that processes data, every interaction we do online. And so I think it's rather. I'm not sure if it sort of captures the enormity of what we're dealing with here by trying to identify it. And this is the one thing I'm worried about because it's general. And actually, in keeping with that, probably my biggest concern, given that this is a general purpose technology, it's like almost the reinvention of the internet itself. Actually, my biggest concern is that the technology, which at the moment at the foundation level is only being built by a handful of Chinese and American companies, because they're the only one with the money, with the GPUs, with the data and the energy capacity to build the underlying architecture. My biggest concern is that it's not democratized enough, that because it's a general purpose technology, it should be generally available. And in my view, that's why open source, which is something that we do at Meta and other companies do as well, both Chinese and American, I think open source is going to be so vital. Otherwise, all the applications, good and bad, of this technology will end up in the sort of clammy hands of a very small number of private sector operators, and that seems to be unsustainable.
And we'll get into open source more down the road. Hannah, take us through sort of what big concern sort of stands out to you.
Now, if I'm looking to areas, for example, from the European Commission side, in where we are investing to AI and when we are combining it with security, it's, for example, our external borders, because in the border control, we can work much more effective way if we are using AI to monitor the situation there. And also, when we look, for example, our critical infrastructure, we know that it has been very much under attack, and we have also witnessed several sabotages, especially when it comes to undersea cables. So to be able also to better protect our critical infrastructure, we are using also AI, for example, for that. So there's several areas now where we are working in the European Commission when it comes to security.
Got it. Ian, how about you?
So stipulating that we all are enthusiastic about AI, but we're
Of
talking
course.
about risks.
Yep.
Look, it's clearly going to make criminals more dangerous. It's going to make tinkerers make more consequential mistakes. And it's going to make, most worrying for me, human beings more like computers. And what I mean by that, I mean, everyone's talking about artificial general intelligence and when we're going to get there.
Right.
I think we're going to get to artificial human intelligence faster than we get to artificial general intelligence, AHI, right? I mean, Larry Summers talks about how, you know, IQ will become less important, EQ will become more important with AI. I agree. But AI is increasingly programming EQ out of the people that use it, right? And the more powerful EQ, the more powerful AI gets, and the more it's downloaded to give us exactly what we want and engage with us as, you know, even better than people, even smarter than people, even more capable and facile at treating us exactly the way we want to, we are losing humanity. That undermines civil society, it undermines democracy. That's, to me, the most existential danger, because the thing I care about the most is persisting as we are, as people.
Right. Right, absolutely. Lan?
Well, I think, of course, AI's potential risks are in many different levels. I think the highest level would be that AI out of control. I think that's sort of the critical part. But also, I think there are also, I think, cases where I think that AI can generate, security concerns. I saw one example. I think that was, in Nigeria, I think there was a deepfake cases where I think one of the political candidates was, talking about the election as a religious war. That generated huge, disruptions in the election. So I think that type of things that can happen.
Yep, that's a great example. And Jeremy, lastly.
Yeah, well, I'm going to, I think, just emphasize some of the points that have been made already. And firstly, the thing that is affecting the security of citizens right around the world is the way in which criminals are taking up some of these basic tools to perpetrate fraud. And I think that the debate around all of that is not nearly developed enough. I don't think the public have understood it enough, and I don't think politicians are on it. So there is a very short-term thing which is around that. Longer term, then, are we worrying about the loss of control? We're worrying about the way in which this plays into information and trust spaces, and we're worrying about the way in which it could, in some circumstances, be used to create different ways of causing harm, and particularly in the chem bios sectors.
Yeah, so I think just the sheer sort of breadth of all of those responses, I think, really illustrates exactly how big of a scope we're talking about here. I want to jump right into what I will describe as sort of public-private dynamics, right? So that intersection between private companies in the context of AI and security and governments, because the reality is, or at least from where I sit, covering this at Wired, so much of the leadership and the pushing around AI technology and its uses has really been led by the private sector, right? By the biggest technology companies in the world, by really innovative startups. Governments are not necessarily in the driver's seat here. So Nick, I want to start with you from the point of view of Meta. Obviously, in that sort of AI race and a leading player in that space, how do you see the company balancing its corporate interests, right? User engagement, the bottom line, with concerns about security? And, I would be remiss not to sort of tack on to that a more specific question, around mis and disinformation on Meta's platforms. Meta recently announced it would annex its fact-checking operations, at least in the United States. Mark Zuckerberg, in making that announcement, acknowledged that we're going to catch less bad stuff. So in a moment where AI-generated content, right, is a huge area of concern, I'm curious for your point of view, is that a step backwards in the context of AI and security?
Yeah, I don't actually think that has much to do with AI, but I can come back to it if you like. It's a totally legitimate question, but it's not really about AI. Just on the first point, look, I think the world generally, and both in the private and the public sector, looked back at the last decade and a half and decided and thought, I'm talking now like 2 or 3 years ago, hang on a minute, social media and other technologies erupted incredibly quickly, and it took us about a decade and a half to kind of catch up with new laws, new guardrails, new institutions, and so on. And I think there was a general sentiment on actually both sides of the fence, and my job for the last 7 years at Meta has been to try and kind of speak the language on both sides of the fence, that this time governance and issues of public and multilateral governance should proceed in parallel with the technology as much as it can, and not an afterthought about a decade and a half later. So I think that was a very strong impulse. And then that then led to things like the Bletchley Park Summit, which was the first summit on AI safety, and that was then succeeded by the Seoul Summit and so on. And then institutions were set up, the UK and the EU and others set up a AI Safety Institute. The EU, as the Commissioner can describe better than I had, was already working on an AI law, and then before ChatGPT erupted on the scene, and then suddenly tried to retrofit it as soon as generative AI became a thing, and sort of stuck a whole bunch of amendments in it and the sort of final bits of it. The US then created also, or at least the beginnings of a US AI Safety Institute, where companies like Meta and others, as we develop our models, could go through testing and so on. The Biden administration, I was there along with other tech leaders in the White House, signed this executive order laying all this out. That executive order has now been scrapped literally in the last week. I don't know what the status is of the US AI Safety Institute. You might be surprised to hear, even though I'm an outgoing executive of Meta, that it sort of leaves us in a slightly peculiar position as an American company, because we might end up having to jump through the hoops and tests of non-US AI safety institutes if there isn't one in the US, because until last week, our approach was, well, we only work with other safety institutes as a sort of hub and spoke extrapolation of the one that exists in the US. So it's very much up in kind of, in flux now, and as like everything, we will hear from President Trump in half an hour, I think.
Yeah, don't all leave right before
at 5 o'clock. So we might hear more, but I personally think that, broadly speaking, not completely, broadly speaking, that the approach that I saw being promulgated in these multilateral summits, I thought was relatively thoughtful. It was trying to preserve optionality for innovation. It wasn't trying to weigh down everything by trying to second guess or third or fourth guess, downstream risks, which are almost impossible for a generalized technology. They were starting to set up relatively light touch institutions. So I hope, broadly speaking, that multilateral approach will preserve. But I mean, final, and this is Ian's and others' domain, I mean, the interesting thing, why this is so fascinating is this is a classic example of the clash of two forces which will shape our world. It's the globalization of technology and the deglobalization of politics. And it'll be discussed ad infinitum at forums like this. But that's what's going on. And actually what we've seen in the last week is a great example of that. So you've got these technologies, you started having the outlines of a multilateral approach, and now suddenly it's all called, it's now thrown into doubt. It's a classic example when these two things pull in different directions. Do you want me to answer the second one quickly?
Yeah, I do.
So just on misinformation and how you deal with it. The idea of crowdsourcing, in other words, getting users to be involved with identifying misinformation, really is not new, and it's not exclusive to Meta. Clearly, X has done it for a while on something Community Notes. YouTube is experimenting with it itself. And the reason why we're starting with this in the US is really for two reasons. One, in the US, you can agree or disagree on it, you can analyze it till the cows come home, but there was a complete and catastrophic collapse in legitimacy in the fact-checking network we had established in the United States amongst roughly 50% of the population. It is simply not sort of sustainable operating at the scale that Meta does at societal level on something as important as misinfo, having in place a system where basically half the population think that you are deliberately biasing everything against them. You can agree or disagree with it, but it's just not sustainable. There's a basic level of legitimacy you need. And the second thing is scale. We operate at vast, vast scale. And we have at the moment, we work with the largest network of fact checkers around the world in over, I think, 60, 70 languages. We could employ 2, 3, 4 times as many fact checkers that exist. You're still only ever going to be scraping a tiny, tiny amount of misinfo content at the very top of the full volume of content. The idea of a sort of Wikipedia crowdsource style approach to misinfo, where you get users saying, actually, this doesn't look right, and then you label it appropriately, is in theory, and I stress in theory, of course Meta now needs to do the hard yards, is in theory something you could actually scale more effectively than just relying on a handful of sort of professional fact checkers. So that's what the company's going to try and do. That's the rationale for it.
Sure, and I certainly understand that, Meta uses AI technology to detect AI-generated content on its platforms. Is that correct?
Yeah.
But my understanding was that the independent fact checkers were essentially a backstop to that technology. If that's not the case, that's fine, and I'm happy to move on.
The fact checkers can fact check and so on. I mean, one thing I'd like, before this, last year was the largest set of elections in the democratic era. Billions of people were able to go. It's never happened before in the democratic era. And at this time last year, I was being told constantly events like this, that the whole year was going to be disfigured. AI was going to hijack democracy. Democracy was going to end. Every election was going to be completely flooded with synthetic content. The most important conclusion of the last year, and I don't want to be complacent, I'm not saying this is a prediction of the future, is how little of that happened. And what you see in companies like Meta is that they actually build systems which go after misinfo and disinfo, however you define that. They go after the content, not the genesis of it. It doesn't matter whether it's produced by a human being or a robot. If it's disinfo or misinfo, the systems, and they are AI, they're machine learning systems, are actually extremely sophisticated at going after the content. And I got super frustrated last year. Everyone freaked out about the fact that you now have AI-generated content. But the systems are built to go after the content itself. And so far, they've been proven to be relatively robust. Doesn't mean, by the way, in the future, we won't have to deal with vast amounts of synthetic slop. We will do, and that's a challenge.
Sure, and I think let's leave it there. I mean, look, it is up to Meta to make this community notes approach and sort of the approach that they are taking to moderation
and to prove it. Sure,
effective.
Sure.
Proof will be in the pudding. We'll see in 4 years. I want to make sure to move on. And Lan, before we step away from this sort of public-private conversation, I do want to make sure to get your point of view, right, from China. I think that's important. When you think about that dynamic between the public and private sector, what stands out to you from China's approach? How do you think these two sectors should be working together where national security is concerned?
Yeah. I think in China's case, I think the AI has already developed very fast over the last decade or so. I think China has taken an approach as I would call it an agile governance approach. I think initially in the early years, I think China had a AI development plan, an overall national plan. And then China came out with some so-called governing principles, providing some general guidance of the AI development, and then also pushed out some foundational legislations, such as personal information protections and so on. And then I think China was taking a more of an adaptive approach when there were problems. I mean, first of all, encourage innovation, but when there were problems coming out, and then have specific regulations to govern those specific domains or application areas. One example is the generative AI, and China actually was the first country came out with a regulation on the generative AI. So I think that's the kind of approach. Of course, China is willing to update of those regulations and also some principles. So I think through that, I think as you can see that the AI has been developed very fast, but also I think in terms of the overall, I think on the security side, I think it's relatively okay. Yeah.
It's sort of this idea of sort of government keeping up with the pace of innovation.
Exactly. And also, I think in many cases when the government is developing some regulation, they actually do have a talk with the companies, inviting company representatives to hear the draft and to see whether that be too much or too little.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Now, let's move on to sort of talking about government a little bit and specifically sort of companies spending time with government, which brings me to the United States. And Ian, I need to ask you, everything that has happened sort of in the last 4 days with regards to the incoming new Trump administration and AI. So Donald Trump earlier this week revoked President Biden's executive order around AI, which contained a lot of detail around security implications specifically. Also announced yesterday, along with Sam Altman, Larry Ellison and others, Stargate, this massive investment in sort of AI infrastructure in the United States. I'm curious sort of your view as of now. Obviously, there's a lot that is still to come. What changes in the United States with regards to AI and national security? What's worrying you? What's sort of standing out to you right now?
Well, I mean, the thing that's changed the most, of course, is that the technology companies and the technology leaders are doing their damnedest to align with this administration in as full-throated and obvious a way as humanly possible. I mean, the one thing we know about Trump as a businessman and as a president is that he's very transactional. What that means is he's pay to play. right? So the more money you give, the more he's going to pay attention to what you want, whether it's his position on TikTok or whether it's, whether you're going to have certain subsidies. And the more you can do that directly for him, the more it matters. We're watching that play out in real time. That has always been a challenge for the U.S. government, frankly, but it has become a much sharper challenge. And I would argue, because I don't think anyone else on the panel will, that Meta and Mark have over-indexed on that compared to other companies, and that is a risk that they are taking. Maybe it's a revealed preference by Mark, but it's a risk they are taking for the medium term. And fortunately for Nick, it is not a risk that he is now taking for the medium term. So there's that.
For the next few weeks.
Yeah, well, no, I think he's okay on that front. I mean, I think it's very clear that's not coincidental, let's put it that way. No, I mean, I thought it was amazing when Mark put out his explanation for why they were changing all these things. It was all about, well, this just, of course, made sense, and we've been wrestling with it for so long, and I mean, this is the better way, and, we don't want censorship, we didn't talk about moderation. It's like, he didn't mention the fact that actually there's a new president, and he's with Elon, and we kind of want to do everything that they're doing because that's what's good for us. I mean, we're not stupid, so at least mention it, right? I mean, I don't know. But that's just me.
But no, I mean, well, it's you and many other people. Bring me back to sort of AI, though, when we're talking about Trump. Sort of, what is concerning to you?
He did mention Trump, by the way.
No, I did, at the end, but not in that way. Not in the reason why he was making these changes. He mentioned Trump at the end by saying, of course, we're going to have a glorious relationship with Trump. I get it. But no, look, that is not my primary point of criticism. It's not like others haven't been doing the same thing. I mean, there's strength in numbers here, right? So let me talk about what's similar. What's similar is that, yeah, Trump is pulling out of global architecture, and we've already seen some of that, not in the AI space, and yeah, he's ripping up some Biden stuff. But in my view, the most important, strong, new institutional architecture that we have seen created since the Soviet Union fell is being created right now by Biden and now by Trump, which is this new diffusion architecture. It's AI, it's data centers, and it is tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and everyone that is a really close friend of the U.S. is going to get on board, and this is a stated preference that of all the things the U.S. government might do in terms of AI, all the priorities they might make to address the concerns that we have and some that we haven't aired, the one that they really want to focus on is containing China. The one they really want to focus on is ensuring that America has the sharp end of the spear of industrial policy and technology and aligning all the friends to do what the Americans want. And I think that's going to be incredibly effective. I think the Europeans are in real trouble. And by the way, the fact that a whole bunch of EU and NATO countries aren't in that architecture creates an opportunity for those countries individually to come to Trump and say, hey, I will do what you want to make that deal. And the Europeans better not do that. They need to act collectively, right? Because the whole EU should be in tier 1. All of NATO should be in tier 1. And that has to be done together. Europeans are doing a very effective job on that on Russia-Ukraine. In the last 3 months, I have seen the Europeans help move Trump to a more collective position on Russia-Ukraine than he was in when he won. But that's because that's existential for the Europeans. Are they doing that on technology? I don't see that yet. Well, here, I mean, obviously, that's more your expertise, but I worry about it.
Hannah, take it from here, sort of talk us through, the EU position here. What does the EU potentially stand to lose ground on in this new world order when it comes to security and artificial intelligence? Sort of where do you worry about potential backsliding, as it were, with the incoming Trump administration, sort of having that kind of global influence?
What we have to do in Europe is that we have to close the innovation gap, because we know that we are lagging very much behind now when it comes to innovations and investments in Europe. And there we have to really work in several sectors. So I think the most important thing is that we have to have innovation-friendly regulatory framework. We are very much criticizing that we have too much bureaucracy in Europe, and I think we have to take it very seriously. We have to make it easier for businesses to invest in Europe. We are too fragmented still. There's too much barriers between our member states, and we are also missing private investments and venture capital. We are quite much using public funding when it comes to AI and new technologies, but there we also need a single market. Capital Markets Union. So there are several fields where we have to work, and we are very committed to build up our own capacities now when it comes to technologies, especially when it comes to AI. and also to quantum computing, where we are very strong already, and then, of course, semiconductors, which is very much preconditioned to any other critical technology. So we are very committed to that we want to invest more, and we want to be more attractive also for the innovations from all over the world. But we have some strengths also when it comes to these critical technologies. We have very strong researchers here, and also we have very strong startups. And I think we have a lot of potential. But now we have to really make it happen. And as you know, next week we will propose and present our competitiveness compass. And there we will very much also show now the path for next 5 years, what we want to achieve. But of course, competition is very hard now globally with USA and with China when it comes to technologies.
Well, let me sort of move us then into that sort of geopolitical piece that I think is so important here and that you and Ian both just highlighted, right? Ultimately, what one major geopolitical player here does will impact all of them, right? And then we'll have a trickle-down effect on, smaller nations, developing economies. Lan, I want to turn to you, right? You just heard what Ian said, which I think is spot on from the point of view of the United States. I mean, it's all about sort of global dominance in this quote-unquote AI arms race with China. Obviously, China is incredibly competitive when it comes to AI development, but that dynamic between China and the US, right? How can these big geopolitical players, China and the US and the EU sort of being top of mind here, develop some sort of global standard, some sort of global norm around AI while acknowledging that their priorities may ultimately not be aligned? Like, what needs to happen for that to actually become the reality, the world that we're living in?
I think, first of all, I think we have to recognize actually both US and China have contributed greatly to this ecosystem in AI space. I think look at the academic papers and patents. China published more papers than any other country over the last 10 years. Patents the same. So I think that both countries are contributing greatly to this ecosystem. And they work together, many scholars work together and so on. So I think in terms of the sort of national competition, I think it's more of the US viewing China as a rivalry and sort of having this chip embargo that indeed hurt China in some way. But I think that we heard, I think 2 days ago, the Vice Premier Ding, who made the comments here talking about AI, I think technology and so on, he said that China would not blindly following the trend to, mindlessly compete. So I think that actually indeed it shows that actually Chinese AI development has indeed, I think, not chasing the big models as such, but rather it's more focusing a lot on smart kind of a competition, and also on the application areas. So we see some, evidence of that, like DeepSeek, that really having a very, smart way of really algorithm that actually allows you to having the same kind of, function, but at the same time, much less energy consumption. That's the kind of thing that I don't think that Chinese companies see U.S. as a big competitor, but rather they're really trying to find application domestically. And also, of course, I think when possible, compete globally. And I think that the outcome of that is you see the, great benefits to the consumers, like TikTok. Right? I mean, we see this, and when TikTok was banned, I see people find red notes. It's another, wonderful example. So I think actually there are many ways actually the two countries can work together. But also I think on the security side, I think both US and China recognize the security concerns. So actually I think we know that last year there was a track 1 dialogue, and also there was track 2 dialogue, mostly on the security side. And I think that, of course, I think our colleagues mentioned about the AI Safety Research Institute. So there's indeed a global network of that. And China is also, working, having its own network of AI Safety Research Institutes in China. And they're trying to be part of that. Unfortunately, I think there are still in some forces in the US that didn't want China to be part of that. So we hope that this, with the new administration, that will change.
Now, Jeremy, I was actually just going to turn to you.
Okay, well, I'm going to come in on this, and I want to bring it back to national security more from a practitioner's perspective.
Please.
So there are lessons from history on how states work together on the highest potential threat areas, and of course the nuclear example is the one that we most readily move to in this space. And I think there are lessons from that. So looking at the areas of most potential harm, trying to make sure we have lines of communication and dialogue, looking at international law and checking on its applicability given new forms of technology. So there's a roadmap for there. I think it's imperative that China is in alongside those sorts of conversations. And that's why the UK took the approach it did at Bletchley last year, inviting China along. So we mustn't lose that. But I want to turn back to two things that have been said previously in this conversation. The first is this point about over-indexing, in your point. And the problem here is that the over-indexing is coming from the private sector, whereas in the past, these sorts of technologies and capabilities with these sorts of ramifications have largely been developed through military public sectors under government control. And so the fact that a company is over-indexing, whether it's Meta or not, or one of the other, plenty other companies you could point to out there, the fact that a company is over-indexing, that is causing us as practitioners more concern because it's the private sector doing it. And the public sector, the national security community, governments are having to find out and work on new ways of getting their arms around that, of new ways of influencing. And this comes back down to a different way of partnering. So I'm no longer there, but if you're sat at the top of a national security agency at the moment, you are looking at capabilities, you are looking at data, you're looking at skills, and in all three of those areas, you're thinking, where do they come from? And they are, a lot of those, the dominance in those is coming from the United States. So as national security communities, whether you're in the UK or elsewhere in the world, then the Rubik's Cube you are trying to solve is how do you get some pieces that fit in with that trajectory of American national security that makes you as relevant as you've been in the past 75 years. Now, from the UK's perspective, we've always been a much smaller player than the United States. But there isn't a day that goes past when what happens in the UK isn't on the desk of the president. And so I think what we've got to do in Europe, what we've got to do in the UK, what we do in other allies of America is work out what is the version of that for an AI and a tech-dominated world that gives collective security not only to those people who might be the main recipients of it, but to America as well.
Ian, do you have a view on sort of what that could look like? And I'm curious, what I wanted to make sure to ask you and a few of you, this idea of global alignment, right, between the US and China, the EU, these big players, how realistic does that feel at this moment in time?
Well, first of all, when I talk about building institutions that are stronger, the difference between this and say the other one that's come up recently, which we all talked a lot about, Belt and Road, is that Belt and Road, the Chinese build a port, but anyone can use the port, right? So, you'd like it to be built by the US or by the UK or by Japan, as opposed to by China, given, sort of levels of openness and contracting and the rest. But, you still want them to have ports. On the other hand, if AI and what is coming in the box in a tier one country is only determined by, sort of the US and a small number of companies, then that is necessarily really problematic to China. And if the only countries that aren't part of that alignment are weaker, poorer countries, right, then, I think you are setting up for big challenges. Now, to be fair, there are places where the Chinese are dominant. And, you look at, the other big, sort of ecosystem of new technologies, which is transition energy, and the Chinese are becoming dominant. In some ways, they already are. And so, I could imagine a world where, electrons are moved primarily by China in 20 years, and where, AI is moved primarily by the United States. That's a very interesting kind of world. But let's get back to the point that was just made, which is really important, which is the over-indexing is being done by the private sector,
yes,
right? The sovereignty is in the hands of the private sector. And so, to go to another company, as opposed to Meta, I look at OpenAI, which I don't know if they're ahead because I'm not a technologist, but they certainly sell themselves as being ahead.
They talk about being ahead.
They're very good at that,
According
right?
to them, they're ahead.
According to them, they're ahead. And, I look at what their mission is, and the mission is to create AGI, and their definition of that is where, sort of a computer or an AI can do, tasks better than human beings on the entire range of economically productive activity. Now, there is no problem with that as long as the government is the one that's doing the appropriate regulation. But if the company exerts sovereignty, that's great for like shareholders. It might even be great for consumers if they're not products. It might be great for consumers. Depends on what they want to do with it. But it's certainly not great for citizens, right? And governments are the ones that need to be looking out for citizens and determining the range of things that AI does as it becomes so powerful. I can't think of governments out there that would want AI and AGI to be solely or maybe even principally developed for, maximizing economically productive work as defined by OpenAI. That strikes me as enormously problematic because, the last time we did that, we got negative externalities. That's how we got climate change. What do you think the negative externalities are going to be for AI? So I have no problem with the private sector defining this however it wants, as long as the ultimate sovereignty lies in the hands of the government. And right now, we are not remotely close to that being true.
Now, Nick, let me sort of take one more question to you, and then we're going to turn to questions from the group. I did want to touch a little bit on sort of the idea of trickle-down effects, right? That the decisions around AI and security that are made in the context of the US, China, the EU, right? Those will have trickle-down impacts on, emerging economies, on smaller countries, perhaps more fragile ones. I know Meta has been a very vocal proponent of open source AI for many different reasons. I would love to hear just a little bit from you to articulate why that is, right? Because I think one could also make a lot of arguments around, open source AI or open source models and, national security risk, right? So talk us through sort of the benefits.
So open source is not new. It's as old as the hills. In fact, everything we do, all cybersecurity is based on open source technology. The internet itself is based on open source technology. Android is based on open source technology. Encryption protocols are based on open source. You remember the old battles between Linux and Windows. Open source, so that you share the technology, or in the case of AI, you share the weights, it's open weights, is something which very much goes with the grain of technology. And generally, if you look over the last 30, 40 years, open source technology tends to win out over closed or proprietary technology, just because you get the wisdom of crowds, you get people innovating, you get people who can check on the weaknesses in an open way, rather than just relying on whichever company runs the technology doing a sort of patch and mend job in themselves. And it's something which Meta's been doing for ages. We have open sourced over 1,000 AI databases and models over the last decade. It's also, of course, in the companies. Of course, it's a company. It's not a charity. It's in the company's own interest. Our business model doesn't depend, unlike some other business models, on us charging people a fee for access to our foundation model, because Meta is has an ads-based business model, and we basically use that as a sort of cross-subsidy to spend whatever it is, $40–50 billion a year we're spending, which is, by the way, which is the answer why this is being run by the private sector, because the public sector can't afford it.
But
which European country could afford $50 billion a year on data infrastructure?
Open source models as sort of beneficial in the context of national security, I'm curious about that.
Well, look, at the end of the day, you're not going to... Open source is happening. It's happening everywhere. There are wonderful Chinese open source models. The Quen family of open source models are highly performant models. As I said earlier, I wouldn't think about it as like something you can keep under lock and key, and then if it escapes the cage, somehow it's going to be spooky and dangerous. It's not like that. You can hack closed source models.
Sure.
Open source models allow for a very high degree of innovation, yes, by bad people, but crucially also by good players. And crucially, it's the way that you democratize access to this technology. I just think I cannot stress enough. We've talked a little bit AI here in a slightly loose way. There's lots of different levels to the stack. You've got the foundation, you've got the training model, then you've got the inference, then you've got the fine-tuning, then you've got everything that's built on top of it, which is, by the way, where all the value is going to be. That's where all the value is going to be. In my own view, I'm not a European commissioner. If I was Europe, I wouldn't even try and compete on the foundation model level. There's no way that Europe's going to catch up. But Europe could leapfrog America and China in terms of deployment, what I call the sort of app level of AI. But when it comes to security, if you look at the really innovative ways in which we changed our license requirements recently, I announced this on behalf of the company, so that the US and the Five Eyes nations could use Llama for their own sort of security purposes. It's just a very versatile way of using the technology. And if I may, just one final thing, which people sometimes don't focus on. When you run an open source model, you have complete sovereignty over it on your servers. There's no API-based link back to the servers in the West Coast. And that's disproportionately important when you're running these models in for sensitive applications, government security, and so on and so forth. So when whether it's Jeremy's old agency, let's say, was to use Llama, they have complete control and sovereignty of it. No data flows back to Mark Zuckerberg and Meta. That's one of the reasons why open source technology, open source AI models are so well disposed towards innovative security applications.
We've covered a lot of ground. I do want to make sure we have time for a couple of questions. We've got about 4 minutes left, and then we can all go see what Donald Trump has to say. Let me open it up to the room. Go for it. Do we have microphones that we're handing out? Let's start here.
Hello, I'm Devyani from India, and I have a question that according to you, what are the policy and regulations the government must place to safeguard from misinformation, disinformation, and ethical use of AI? And do we need to form a body, for example, like WHO, to analyze and monitor it globally? As corporates, do you think it will be beneficial to better operate?
Who wants to take that? Go for it.
Yes, in the European Union, we want to have a digital environment that is fair and safe and democratic. And that's why we have put in place several regulations. And also, for example, when it comes to disinformation, we have Digital Service Act. And the very large online platforms, they need to themselves assess and mitigate the systematic risks they are posing, for example, to civic discourse. And they have to also have practices in place how they are making sure that they are not spreading misinformation and disinformation, but they can choose themselves what kind of practices they are using. For example, in Europe, Meta is using fact checkers, not in USA anymore. Some of the platforms, they are using these community notes that the users are flagging the content. But I think it's important that we are putting rules also for the online platforms and for the digital service providers. Because in Europe, we see that it's very important that the same rules which are applying in our physical world, the same rules also apply in digital world. So what is illegal offline is also illegal online.
I think we probably have time for one more question. I think I saw over here. Great.
Thank you. I'm Ayano Sasaki from Japan, and as a part of the Davos 50 of the Global Shapers Committee. So without depending on any other big countries like China and the United States, relatively small country cannot secure countries. That's what I felt by listening to this sessions. But the security seems very fragile. Like achieving security will contribute to the emerging of the new threats like a war and something like that. So my question is, how can we secure our country, relatively small countries, in the era of this AI?
Yeah, that's an almost impossible question to answer, isn't it? But I think I can offer a clue, which is at the very core of this is a strategic understanding of threats and an understanding of the things that are most important in the country to defend. And too often, I think this conversation goes deep down into technology, it goes deep down into regulation without having a proper thought about risk. So a company like Japan, what is it that secures Japan's prosperity, its economic success, and its security in the region? And then I think you build a platform and a strategy out from that.
Were you going to say something too?
Yes, I think it's also very important to build partnerships with the like-minded countries, so especially when it comes to security, because nearly all of the countries are too small alone. And especially, for example, in Europe, where we have European Union, which is a union of 27 different member states. For example, cybersecurity is a field where nobody couldn't be successful alone, so there we have to work together. So I think it's important to find like-minded, trusted partners also.
Well, we are at time. I think we have a hot commodity session starting in about 45 seconds. So thank you all to our panelists for being here. Thank you all for being here. Thank you on the live stream.
Thank you.